Hello, I realize I've talked a lot about using game design for storytelling in D&D, but never really talked about how to do that. Let's do that! So, storytelling in D&D actually works a lot the way that you might expect, based on other videos that I've done, if you've seen those. If not, go see those. They're excellent. Maybe. I want to talk about decisions and how they reflect narrative. That might actually seem obvious, in which case, great, we're already halfway there, because that's really the thing that you want to be thinking about is decisions, player decisions. And that's really the core of why I argue that D&D is a game first and a story second, because what I really mean is not don't tell stories. What I mean is don't think about story in terms of like storytelling, like writing, like coming up with lore and dialogue and plot elements. That's not really the important thing. The important thing here is the decisions that the players make. So I'll give you a quick example. If the player is making a decision about whether to do an insight check or something, and then they do an insight check, and you punish them somehow by, making it, let's say you make it obvious that they're trying to size somebody up. That's not really how insight works, but don't worry about that for now. Let's say they're trying to size somebody up. The person that they're trying to size up also makes an insight check and succeeds, and they realize, oh, you're trying to figure something out. So they get really cagey, or they do something even aggressive, depending on the situation, whatever. That causes a problem, potentially. It creates a situation. The situation is that the players now know that there is potential for failure in their insight checks. That can be useful as a tool, but the most likely thing it's going to cause, unless you're being very precise about every design element in your game, which you're probably not being, and even if you are, you might be getting some of that wrong, and if you're getting any of it wrong, this can break down, so I don't recommend trying to make it that precarious. But what you've done is essentially, inadvertently, probably, punished them for making an insight check. Now that can be a problem, because now they're probably not going to make as many insight checks. So the story element there is about the decision that the player made and the iterations that they'll make in the future. I talked about this concept, I think, once before, but I call it actionable iteration, the idea being that like these are iterations that the players can feel like they can actually act on. That being, they do something, they get feedback from the game, and then they make a new decision based on the information that they now have, which hopefully arms them to make a better decision in the future. That's a very sort of overly simplified explanation of how that works, and you'd like layer a bunch of different ones on top of each other, but basically the idea is in this situation with the insight check, what's happening is the player is making an insight check, and then the information that they have is that insight checks pose risk, which means they're less likely to make insight checks. That might not necessarily be a problem. Let me be clear about this. The objective statement about design is if you punish insight checks, players will be less likely to make insight checks. That's objective because it's testable. You can test that and prove that. And then you can be more specific about that and say, well, my players are are more likely or less likely. Or you can change the situation, add more variables, right? If I punish them in this specific way, this will be the outcome. But broadly speaking, I think it's probably fair to assume that if you punish insight checks, players will be less likely to make insight checks. That isn't necessarily a problem. You might want to reduce the number of insight checks your players are making, in which case, okay. Like, based on the kinds of goals you have, that is or isn't a problem. But if you're looking at it in isolation, it's probably a problem, because insight checks are one of the methods players have for interacting with the world and with the NPCs, and they're an opportunity for you to give information to them. So making players not want to do insight checks is obviously going to be a bit of an issue, because that removes some of your tools. Not great. So the way that this works in narrative, why this matters for storytelling, is basically that if the players are making that decision and then making a new decision later, it's not just that you're removing the ability to give them information and therefore the narrative is less easy to tell. That's not it. It's potentially part of the problem, but it's not the main problem. The main problem is that now what you've done is you've told the story about how you shouldn't be suspicious of people, right? And obviously, if you just do that once, that's not really necessarily true. You'd have to set it up and there's different ways that can unfold and different implications that might have. The point is, the main implication is the decision the players made and the information and feedback that they got from making that decision. And that, in D&D, is the main tool that you have for storytelling. So, if you're trying to figure out what to do in your game, this is not really like a one-time off, do this thing and it'll be good, here's a mechanic that's cool, or a system, or even really a process, strictly speaking. It's really just a matter of when you're doing things like making players make checks and giving them feedback for what that check is, really try to consider what that player's expectation is, and then be very aware of how what you give them back might affect their decision-making in the future. Because those decisions are really what drive story. And it might not seem like that, especially to a DM, it might not feel that way, but like it or not, your players are not actually the characters, right? People like to say, oh, no metagaming. But at the end of the day, your players are just humans who play characters. And so they're affected by the things that happen, and those emotional differences that you create through associations, are the things that they're going to bring in, and that's going to influence them. You can say no metagaming all you want, but at the end of the day, you can't stop them from just being human beings, right? So you have to take some responsibility as the DM for that, and I think there are things that players should take more responsibility for in games, but this is definitely something that DMs should be taking responsibility for. Like, you can share responsibility, but this is one of the things that I think is very, very solidly the DM's responsibility, is to be considering these things. Because once the player feels a certain way, it's going to be very difficult for those players to really break out of that headspace. And if you have a player who's just not that interested in making insight checks because you constantly punish them for making insight checks, then, that's on you, right? You can't say, well, even if you don't want to make insight checks, you have to make insight checks. Like, it doesn't work that way. And you have to be very careful about what that implies in the story. So let me make one last point before I sign off for the day to try to bring this into clarity, bring this into perspective a little bit. The idea here is consider the narrative implications, not just of what's happening with the NPCs, not just what the NPCs are saying, not just what the plot elements are, not just what the theme of even if you have like this broad theme, consider how the actual player decisions, the decisions that the players are making, are functioning as part of, ideally the core of, the story that you're telling. So the idea here is basically to say, all right, we have all these elements. How does gameplay fit into that? And gameplay fits into that by just accounting for the player decisions. And that's really the key to everything. And that's what unfolds. Everything unfolds from that, right? Everything expands from that center point. And that's how you can use game design as a core, because this is fundamentally a game design question. What are players deciding and why are they making those decisions? That is fundamentally a game design decision, not a writing decision, not a storytelling decision. It can also be a storytelling decision, but it's primarily a game design decision, and that's why that's sort of the core of everything. So when you're doing anything, always consider what decisions are the players making and how are they being rewarded or punished? What's the feedback that they get for that decision? And what does that imply to the player from the player's perspective? I can go more in depth into that, but this is starting to get a little bit long, and I think the longer it goes, the more rambly it gets. So we're going to call it there. I think that's fine. I haven't uploaded anything for a while, so let's just get something out that's okay, at least. Hey, I have a new kind of like setup. I'm using my phone as a camera now. I think it's a much better camera. I was using a webcam before. That's stupid. I have a phone. Anyway, if you liked things, I know there have been a couple comments about like, oh, this channel needs more views. Like, comment, and subscribe. I know that sounds really cliched and stupid, but that's just how you tell the algorithm, this is good, send it to more people. So if you think it should be sent to more people, that's how you can help make that happen. And I would appreciate it a lot also. Thank you. Goodbye. Bye.